Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. Give the people what they want. Coming to you a day off our normal schedule. Today's Saturday, because Zoe and I are in the middle of a city called Glasgow in Scotland, where the COP26, unfortunately, friends, it's called COP26, but it's nothing to do with the police convention. It's the conference of parties regarding climate change. And it's Zoe and I and Prasanth from People's Dispatch, your favorite web portal for news, peoplesdispatch.org, bringing you Give the People What They Want on November the 6th instead of November the 5th, for which we apologize. But what can you do? Here's the world of news people. It's Glasgow. It's raining. I know we're in an Airbnb with all kinds of junk behind us. Sorry about that, friends. But we're in the front lines to bring you the smell of the protests. Yesterday, big youth protests taking place, a massive march, lots of people trying to demand climate financing. I'll talk about that later. It's rainy. Today's the big march. Are we excited about the big march?
Yeah, seems like maybe 100,000 people might come out today, despite the rain, despite all of the restrictions to get here and to participate. It'll be pretty historic.
It'll be pretty historic, but if some of this rain could be diverted to Iraq, that would be a good thing, because in Iraq, the government's agricultural ministry is telling us that only 1/3 of the durance, 1/3 of the land that is cultivatable is being cultivated as a consequence of a multi-year climate change induced drought. Friends, a multi-year climate change induced drought. Only 1/3 of the land can be cultivated this year. That's a direct result of climate change. And my God, are we confident about this COP? Sometimes I think it's not conference of parties, but it's countries of polluters. The United States President Joe Biden comes with 85 cars and goes to sleep.
You can't make it up.
He went to sleep. This is a fact. Boris Johnson looked sleepy himself. They're not serious, these men who govern the most developed countries, the countries with money, with technology. They're not serious. And they have been blocking very credible, very good initiatives coming up from other countries in the world, many poorer countries, including small island states, which are directly at the front lines, friend, of this climate catastrophe. They're going to face it first. Not only small island states. I know we often talk about small island states, but also low-lying coastal areas. The coast of Bangladesh, for instance, has already faced great, dangerous erosion, not only in the developing countries, poorer countries, but also in the developed countries, the coastline of the Gulf Coast of the United States, Louisiana, Mississippi, torrential, terrible hurricanes coming and tearing through people's lives. Is this a consequence of human-produced climate catastrophe? Seems like it is. The difference between this COP now, 2021 in Glasgow, Scotland, and COP at Paris in 2015 is that in between 2015 and 2021, we've had, I don't know how many, we've had a series of reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they have made an impact. And you know what else has made an impact? How many people did you say today?
Today, there's an estimate around 100,000. Yesterday, there were 25,000 youth on the street.
25,000 young people on the street. Yesterday, Zoe and I met with 200 of them who came from Belgium on 4 buses. They took a long time to fundraise to get these buses, and I actually don't know how they drove a bus across the English Channel, but these are very smart Belgian children and young people. I was very impressed with them. They put climate squarely on the agenda, and whereas in 2015 the big countries refused to allow discussion of carbon emissions caps, at 2021 COP they have to at least talk about it, even though not seriously. Isn't that like a phrase for our times? Talk about it, even though not seriously. Human rights on the table also, because some of the impact of the carbon crisis is that there'll be human rights violations against people. There is no greater human rights open sore violation on our planet than the people of Palestine, what they face. Prashant, what's been happening in Palestine? I saw recently another 13-year-old boy was killed, but what's the story? What's happening there?
Right, Vijay. Today, I just wanted to bring another update about a struggle we've been covering for a very long time, which is that of Sheikh Jarrah. And the fact that on Tuesday, the families, four families who were offered a compromise by the Israeli Supreme Court decided to reject that compromise offer. Now, we know that Sheikh Jarrah over the past few months has actually become a microcosm for the larger Palestinian struggle as well, because these are people who were refugees, who gave up their refugee status who gave the refugee status on the assurance of homes. And now they are being told to vacate the homes in which they lived for decades because, some Israeli organization claims that the land originally belonged to a Jewish community or Jewish groups. And this is almost like a microcosm for the larger issue as well. And it's not only the demand by the organization, but also the fact that the Israeli state, the Israeli legal system have all 100% sided with this organization. So it's actually not at all surprising that the Sheikh Jarrah issue became one of the, triggers for this mass uprising that took place in Palestine over the past few months. And on the one hand, of course, people around Palestine have been protesting around the world as well, but also that these families have been, determined that they are not going to exceed an inch, so to speak. So recently, the Israeli Supreme Court offered them a compromise according to which they would be allowed to stay there as protected tenants. Now, it's very important to know the terminology is protected tenants, as long as they gave what the Israeli media hailed as a nominal rent to the organization, to the Jewish organization concerned, Yad Shimon. And also the fact that, these families would be allowed, be considered first-generation settlers, which means they could have descendants, 2 generations, so the descendants could stay there. All this, of course, concealing the fact that basically what this meant was while legally they may be allowed to stay there, in principle, they had given away the rights of ownership to the other organization because they're now paying rent and it's not their homes anymore. So that really is what it boiled down to. And the fact that this was a compromise offered by the Israeli Supreme Court really speaks to how institutionally these families and the Palestinian people have been targeted throughout all these years. So now what lies ahead is a difficult question because it is believed that now the court might pronounce a verdict. It is possible that the court might, decide in favor of the organization, in which case these families will be faced with a situation where they have to leave. Now, the last time this happened, of course, it led to mass protests. And, just because these are a few families in what is a small region in East Jerusalem, I think doesn't take away from the historic significance of the struggle and the kind of resonance that the way it resonates with Palestinians, with supporters of the Palestinian cause across the world. So definitely something to sort of look out for and watch out for as well, because we've been seeing, and the other aspect, of course, is the fact that Palestinian hunger strikers they've been striking against administrative detention. Seven people on hunger strike. The longest ones are around 114 days. At least 2 people. Somebody on 114 days is Qaid al-Fasfus, and the other person on 107 days today. And just imagine people on a hunger strike for over 3 months, and their demand is basic that the administrative detention policy not be discontinued for them, because one of the Qaid al-Fasfus, who's been in jail since October 2020, and he's just been on administrative detention, which is where they keep extending your jail term without mentioning any charges. So Israel's solution has been that they have suspended the administrative detention, which means that if anything happens to these Palestinians, it will be the responsibility of the hospital. And Israel can claim that they were not technically in jail when something happened to them. Organizations are warning that their health is in a deep crisis. So and wherever you look in Palestine, whether it be the prisons, whether it be your homes, whether it be public spaces, places of worship, Al-Aqsa Mosque again, raided by Israeli security forces on Thursday. So in every aspect, we see an attempt to erase the culture, the existence of Palestinians. And like you said, it's one of the biggest open sores of human rights violations. On the other hand, it is also one of the biggest sites of resistance that people see around us, that we see around us today. So definitely a lot of issues to keep watch.
Prashant, all these stories, they could have been written last year, 5 years ago. Israeli troops in Al-Aqsa, another person killed, Sheikh Jarrah. It's incredible how there's a repetitive nature to these protests. The government of Chile is toward the end of its term. There'll be an election, first round in November, likely second round in December. Chile as well, there's a cliched quality to the news. One Mapuche killed, another Mapuche arrested. This has happened to a Mapuche. That has happened to Mapuche. This has been going on for almost 500 years. Zoe, update us. What's the latest in this series of, I'm sorry to say it, but cliched stories?
Yeah, well, really, it's a very tragic situation in the Mapuche territory, Walmapu. So as we have all of these leaders coming to Glasgow talking about, the need to protect the environment, to support the people in the frontline communities, of course, the Mapuche people have been resisting to protect their territories from logging, from the predatory action of capital in their territories, been trying to recover the land that they were violently, evicted from. As of October 12th, Sebastián Piñera declared a state of emergency in the Mapuche territory. It's called the Araucanía in Chile. And that has essentially meant that the military has been occupying their land. And in this context, to a young man of 23 years old, Jordan Machacan, was killed by a member of the armed forces. Another was gravely injured. Dozens of others, with similar, bad injuries. And this is, just a horrible situation because it is, while these heads of state are talking about the need to protect the environment, this is how they're treating people who are protesting to protect their land. And this is a pattern that we're seeing quite frequently across Latin America right now, using the state of emergency as a tool to quell protests and to kind of militarize the response to these protests. So in Chile and in the Mapuche territory, this has been happening for years. But, Vijay, you recently wrote an article with Tarwa in Ecuador. Guillermo Lasso has responded to protests in the country in a similar way. He's using the kind of excuse of, drug trafficking and crimes to declare a state of exception in the country, which gives the armed forces basically complete impunity to act how they want. It actually has a clause in the Ecuadorian state of emergency saying that they will not be, penalized for their actions. And he believes that they're often treated too unfairly when they commit these crimes. Similarly, farther north in Central America, in Guatemala, where the indigenous community has been protesting against a nickel mine where companies have been illegally extracting nickel from this mine that was, technically that was supposed to be suspended. And they had been protesting on the streets of Guatemala to block the mining company's trucks from coming in. And in response to this, what happens? The president decrees a state of siege. They completely evicted the protests and responded by raiding the homes of dozens members of the Indigenous Ancestral Council, by journalists who are accompanying this. So this is a very worrying trend that we're seeing. And of course, in Chile, this has resulted in the death of a 23-year-old member of the Mapuche community. And we've seen this militarized response across the continent, across the region, and it's quite worrying. And so we need to see, it's unfortunate that these leaders come to these big, conferences with big words, with that we're going to invest and that we're going to, enter into these partnerships, fulfill these goals. But when it comes down to it, the people who are trying to protect nature and trying to conserve the environment and promote alternative solutions, and it doesn't mean, no extractivism across the board. But for example, in Guatemala, they're asking for there to be a consultation that when they are implicated, when their territories are going to be affected, that they must be properly consulted. And this is a ILO convention 169. And so these are very important to keep in mind as we're discussing, combating climate change, preserving the environment, that these are the communities who are being affected and also being criminalized, being assassinated. And the Mapuche community is calling it continuation of the genocide.
Continuation of the genocide. Some people use the term in Palestine, permanent Nakba, permanent catastrophe. It's not something that happened in 1948. I suppose continuation of the genocide means it didn't just happen, when old Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and so on. These are permanent conditions. But interesting, friends, you're listening to Give the People What They Want. We bring you these stories every week on our show. You read them at People's Dispatch. You read them from Globetrotter. You get a sense of what's going on, and look at what's going on. Let's try to summarize our show today, okay? State of emergency declared in Ecuador. State of emergency declared in Chile. State of emergency in Guatemala. Why? Essentially to deal with protesters. You know where there's no state of emergency declared? In the planet Earth. There's a climate catastrophe. There is no state of emergency. During the pandemic, there was a state of emergency declared. Interesting. Central banks during the pandemic raised or created, manufactured $16 trillion. Central banks manufactured $16 trillion in the developed countries to help businesses get through the emergency of the pandemic. To get through the emergency. They were called emergency conditions. There's an emergency in Ecuador, emergency in Guatemala, emergency in Chile. And, we know what happens. 23-year-old killed there. Palestine, it's an occupation. That's a permanent emergency. Again, a 13-year-old killed. People from Sheikh Jarrah being evicted and so on. Pandemic, that was an emergency. I grant you, 16 trillion minimum raised by the central banks. The countries of the developed world pledged to put $100 billion a year. Mind you, I said 16 trillion. That's the T word, trillion. The countries of the developed world pledged to put $100 billion into a climate fund every year. That was the climate fund to help poorer countries make a transition from what is called mitigation. Mitigation means taking care of the negative impact of catastrophic climate change. For instance, Iraq is going through a terrible drought now. How to mitigate that? Well, one way would be to build perhaps better piping. Iraq has a lot of leakage in water pipes, and there's therefore a lot of evaporation from the pipes. Well, make better insulated pipes and so on. That's mitigation finance. And then the green transition finance, so that a country like India will not rely on coal-fired power plants and perhaps use different, cleaner sorts of energy, non-carbon emissions forms of energy. Well, into that climate fund are peanuts. There is no emergency to fill that climate fund. During the day of debate at COP, when the heads of government and ministers were discussing climate finance, there was a day set aside for this. During that day, what they essentially focused on was to prevent multilateral banks and so on from financing fossil fuel industries. Now, that's interesting. The World Bank didn't join it, by the way, just in case you're wondering, which is one of the major financiers of fossil fuel industries. But the sum of money put into that fund is extraordinary. Okay, let's pause again, just because I'm doing a lot of summaries, because you might be losing the fact and the train of thought. $16 trillion raised to help businesses get through the emergency of the pandemic. $100 billion pledged annually for the climate fund. Right now, there's crickets inside that fund. To prevent banks and others from investing in fossil fuel industries, they raised 18 trillion. 18 trillion. Not even near the 18 billion. What did I say? Trillion? No, now I made a mistake. 18 billion. Not even the 100 billion. 18 billion for that. And I want you to pay attention to something. Even that 18 billion is targeting the poorer countries in the world, which are mostly reliant on coal-fired plants and so on. The principal carbon emitters are the advanced countries in the world and China. And China largely emits because China is the manufacturer of the world. It's emitting on behalf of the major consuming countries in the world. They're just not doing anything. They're not doing anything. Climate finance has got to be at the center of the discussion. it is not at the center of the discussion. Place like Iraq, it requires finance. Place like Pakistan requires finance. Unless we get through that, other problems will, be on the table. Many other new problems will arise. In Pakistan, lots of problems are rising. Prashant, what's happening there?
Right. Vijay, again, coming back to an issue we talked about on this show quite often, which is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, the movement fighting for the rights of Pashtuns, and a very important person in that movement, Ali Wazir, who has been, the leader of that movement. He's been in jail since December 2020. Just a few days ago, a court decided to invoke a charge of sedition against him. So, what, of course, is this? His crime of sedition? His crime of sedition involved giving a speech, which seems to be the favored reason for invoking sedition for a lot of people. So we have Ali Wazir, who is in jail for close to a year and being charged with sedition. On the other side of the spectrum, of course, is the fact that the TLP, which is a right-wing party in Pakistan and which just recently conducted a massive rally against the government of Imran Khan, ended up basically getting all the compromises it wanted, which means basically that at the end of the day, the party which was banned for focusing on blasphemy, the party which was banned for, calling for violence against women, this party, and which was basically asking for the expulsion of the French ambassador, this party basically will soon get recognized. So what we have right now is two sides of the coin, two sides of the spectrum in Pakistan, where a left-wing progressive movement which sought justice for the Pashtun people. Of course, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement led a march in 2017 in the region where, because of landmines, so many people have lost their lives, so many people have lost their limbs, and their demand was for justice for these people. Their demand was for compensation. Their demand was for removal of these mines. Their demand was for demilitarization. None of these demands which have really been accepted. But the leaders of these movements have been persecuted continuously. So if you look at, we've written about this extensively on People's Dispatch, many of these leaders facing case after case after case. That's one hand, of course. On the other hand, we also have many of these leaders and members being targeted by armed gangs. For instance, Ali Wazir's brother was assassinated just a few years ago. In 2005, I believe, many members of his family were also assassinated. So the irony is striking right now because, like I said, you have two sides of the spectrum. There's the TLP, which has, made blasphemy its key point, which has targeted minorities. When a Christian woman, Asia Bibi, was acquitted on charges of blasphemy, this organization threatened to kill her. But this organization actually gets legitimacy from the government. There are signs that it might actually be unbanned. On the other hand, progressive activists, people who are fighting for a just cause, facing trial after trial, tribulation after tribulation. And today, like I said, whether it be India, whether it be Pakistan, whether it be many parts of the world, just like you pointed out how emergencies are used to suppress activists, sedition is so convenient a charge. Sedition is so convenient a term, such an umbrella term. Any speech, any act of, even in India right now, the very draconian UAPA law has been imposed against various journalists, some of whom have just tweeted about violence taking place in one state. So this being so it remains to be seen. Of course, all the leaders have denied the charges. They're going to fight the cases. Many of them are on bail. But it's a bit of a bleak situation for the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is the Pashtun Pride movement, as well as the leaders who are actually facing this amount of persecution and violence.
This is a terrible, terrible story. And I think the connection that you made, Prashant, between emergency decrees put forward by the presidents of South America and Central America, and the link between that and the language of blasphemy and sedition in South Asia, I think it's a direct line, and it's very insightful that we put this on the table. I think we should develop this a little more, maybe make an atlas of different forms of the crushing of dissent, and how different kinds of language is used in different places. We're in the middle of a period, and I'm surprised we're waiting till the end of the show to get to this, because Zoe seems to always report about elections in South America and Central America. Stunningly, they seem to have more elections than other people. It's of course not true. Other countries also have elections, but we don't seem to pay attention to them for some reason. And Prashant, that's an indictment of your and my coverage. I'm not sure what's going on, but well, yes, there's been a coup in Sudan, and so, well, the question of elections suspended for now. There will be elections in India, important elections next year. The Legislative Assembly elections to Uttar Pradesh going to be monumental, and I know we'll spend time. You and I will keep coming back to that election just to catch up with the South American story. Nonetheless, Nicaragua, big election, big election. Zoe, what's happening?
Well, this story is, I think, much more about U.S. imperialism than it is about the elections themselves. Of course, this plays a huge role, but tomorrow Nicaraguans are going to vote in general elections. They will elect the president as well as members of the legislation body. And what has the U.S. done ahead of these elections? I think this is the important point here. So in the past couple of years, the U.S. has been increasing its pressure against Nicaragua. Creating a lot of different narratives about the government being dictatorship, being one of the largest violators of human rights that exists on the planet, which, as if you watch Give the People What They Want, I think we can point to a lot of other countries that have, human rights records that are pretty high up there. And the U.S. has started to apply a pressure campaign on Nicaragua, similar to what it's done against Cuba, against Venezuela. Starting with some light sanctions, targeting some officials, starting to add Nicaragua to the troika of, tyranny that it considers that operates out of Latin America and threatens security in the United States. And it's really, grouped Nicaragua with all these other enemies of the U.S. And, this is also to deny the fact that Nicaragua, if you look at Central America, is one of the most stable countries economically in terms of levels of violence. I mean, we talk about Honduras a lot. We talk about El Salvador, Guatemala, countries where thousands of people are leaving every single day because they're not able to survive and because they're not able to lead a healthy and safe existence in their countries because it's overrun by corruption, by U.S.-backed leaders who do not have their best interests in mind. Whereas Nicaragua, it's a lot more stable. There is, state support to many different sectors. The situation of women. We just published a piece in People's Dispatch about this. All of that to be said, that of course Nicaragua's opinion of U.S.'s opinion of Nicaragua has its political motivations, and so they have these big elections coming up tomorrow. Of course, because of the stable situation in Nicaragua, the people are quite in support of the government. Of course, they may have their qualms. They have, of course, not every government has its contradictions. But it's very likely that the Sandinista government led by Daniel Ortega will likely come back to power and will be elected in these polls tomorrow. And so the U.S., in anticipation of this, first this week carried out a massive censorship campaign on social media, closing the Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts of very active Sandinista, activists. So these are not, a lot of them are not government officials, are just people who share news about what's happening in Nicaragua, share information, trying to get the word out because there has been so much censorship and their accounts were closed. And actually an official sent out a whole Twitter thread saying that they had done the largest coordinated counterattack against a troll farm. And they go on to say people who are hired to do social media and they're tweeting from 9 to 5 every day. And, they're tweeting these pro-government messages. And I mean, I don't know, we have to ask ourselves, isn't that, social media management is a job and people, have to tweet information out. That's just part of what it is. And so it's really this kind of, and, no opportunity to get these accounts back, just completely shut down. Then the more, crushing action that they did was to passing the Renacer Act, which was passed with complete bipartisan support yesterday in the United States. And this essentially classifies Nicaragua as, a threat, a human rights threat, and proposes a series of sanctions very crushing sanctions, which, only time will tell, but will likely have a similar effect to what we've been seeing, in Venezuela, in Cuba. And so this is really a dangerous and concerning sign. And tomorrow we'll see what happens, what will be the response of the U.S. political elites to these elections. But Joe Biden has yet to sign the bill, but it has already been praised. It has been lauded by the likes of Marco Rubio and, of course, people on the other side of the aisle.
Troika of tyranny. That's what the US government calls some of these countries. We are the Troika of truth. That's Zoe, Prashant, and I'm Vijay. They are from People's Dispatch. I'm from Globetrotter. We come to you every week, give the people what they want. Troika of truth. If you like the name, tweet about it. See you next week. Bye.